This is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday. Today I'm going to be concentrating mostly on women of yesterday, looking at some June birthdays. These are women I think I've talked about before some time or other because I have been doing this show for almost 10 years now. And I frequently use this book, Remember the Ladies, written by Kirsten Olson, which is a book of days which gives birthdays and death dates of famous women from the past, and occasionally just also assigns somebody who lived so long ago that her birth dates are not known now. Just signs them to a vacant spot, I guess, in the book. Today is June 14th, and so let's begin with a woman who was born on June 14th, and that is Harriet Beecher Stowe, born Harriet Elizabeth Beecher. She was born in Connecticut in 1811. And she is most famous for having written a book about slavery. In fact, when it was published in the early 1850s, it became one of the leading causes, really, for getting sympathy in the North for those people who were opposing slavery. So how was it that Harriet Beecher Stowe came to write Uncle Tom's Cabin? Well, Harriet Beecher Stowe, after being born in Connecticut, moved to our own state of Ohio. She was a young woman by then, about 20 years old, when her father became the leader of the Lane Theological Seminary in Cincinnati. And she and many of her siblings came along. She was the seventh of 9 children. And her father, Lyman Beecher, was a well-known Congregationalist minister. And she had a couple of brothers who became Congregational ministers as well. And one of her older sisters is famous for being an early proponent of kindergarten, which is a German name because kindergarten was first put forward, the idea of a sort of preliminary to school for the youngest of the children of age about 5. And her sister was a big promoter of kindergarten. Well, Harriet Beecher Stowe lived in Ohio for almost 12 years or so. In fact, she married a clergyman in Cincinnati named Stowe, obviously, and she began doing writing. She was writing articles that were published in various magazines and journals and so on. And she was living there in Cincinnati, right across the Ohio River, of course, from Kentucky, a slave state. Ohio was a free state, and although the Northwest Ordinance had proclaimed that Ohio and all the parts of the Northwest Territory would be free from slavery, there was an election held in the early days of Ohio, and anti-slavery only won by 1 vote. That's how close Ohio came to being a slave state. But it was a free state when Harriet Beecher Stowe was living in Cincinnati. And of course, she had an opportunity to cross over to Kentucky numerous times and to meet some slaves who had escaped from slavery across the Ohio River during the era of the Underground Railway. So finally, in the early 1850s, as I mentioned, and after she had moved back with her husband to New England, she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, or Life Among the Lowly. And it was a very sentimental story, but it has maintained its popularity in a sense. We just need to remember that The King and I, which was a nice musical in the 1950s, 100 years after the time of Harriet Beecher Stowe, included a little playlet about Uncle Tom's Cabin and how it's not right to keep people in slavery. So for June 14th, there's the birthday of Harriet Beecher Stowe. And she went on to write a number of other books and so forth. But her book was so successful that it sold several million copies at a time when a popular novel was considered popular in sales if it just sold several thousand copies. And what is more, it was, quote, stolen, that is to say, it had an American copyright, but millions of copies were printed in England without paying any royalties or paying any attention to the fact that the author was Harriet Beecher Stowe, who, as an author, should receive some royalties. Anyway, that's Harriet Beecher Stowe, and she later lived in Connecticut, actually the state where she was originally born. But she lived in Hartford, which is the capital city of Connecticut, and I've had the opportunity to visit the Harriet Beecher Stowe home in Hartford. One of the interesting things about that house is that it's right next door to an even more famous American author of a little later in the 19th century, namely Mark Twain. I'm not too sure how they happened to wind up in adjoining houses, but they did. They both made themselves very popular authors and got a lot of money from their writing and were able to build very fancy houses in an exclusive part of Hartford. The interesting thing I remember from touring the Stowe house was that she had a lot of paintings which were hung up, not flat on the wall as most paintings are in most houses, but she favored hanging them in corners. So it was just interesting to see how many paintings from the 19th century were there hung across corners in the home of Harriet Beecher Stowe in Hartford. Well, I want to go back a little bit in June to an English woman named Harriet Martineau, who was born on June 12th in Norwich, England, in 1802. Now, Harriet Martineau is most famous in our country for having come to the United States in the 1830s. She was here from approximately 1834 to 1836. Now, we don't need to see this picture yet. Right, thank you. He's showing a picture that I'm going to talk about that lady, Lillian Hillman, a little later on. So for a while, you just have to look at me while I talk about people like Harriet Martineau, who was an English woman who was born in 1802 in England, but came to the United States and actually stayed here for 2 years. I think that well, by that time, she was already a well-known author in England. And probably she found that she could accept hospitality at a number of places in the United States because she made a grand tour of the United States, actually, and went to Michigan when it was pioneer territory, went to the western part of Virginia, which is now West Virginia. In fact, when Harriet Martineau visited West Virginia in 1835, I believe, John Marshall, the famous first, well, not first, but probably the most famous of the early Supreme Court justices, who was a Virginian, was still alive, and John Marshall took Harriet Martineau to see a place that I have visited myself, and maybe some of the visitors to this TV show have seen, namely Hawk's Nest. Hawk's Nest in West Virginia has a wonderful view of the valley that overlooks a tributary of the big river that flows past Charleston. And Hawk's Nest itself is like, you know, the edge of a cliff overlooking this tremendous view of West Virginia and the big river there. So Harriet Martineau got to see Western Virginia in the company of the famous jurist John Marshall. Well, as I say, she made quite a tour of the United States. And I remember when I read her autobiography and she was talking about this tour, she spoke about having been on a steamboat on the Ohio River. And she was struck by the informality of Americans. And one of the things that she gave as an example of the informality of Americans was that a teenage girl came up to her on the steamboat and was very interested in her hairstyle, and maybe she had a fancy comb or something in her hair. So this young woman came up and sort of fingered her hair and fingered her combs and things like that. And, you know, she was a totally stranger young woman, and the girl's mother didn't even say anything, you know. So when Harriet Martineau did return home to England, she wrote a book called Society in America. And, you know, there is a much more famous book by a European traveler to America who came and did a grand tour of America just a couple of years before Harriet Martineau's. And that is Alexis de Tocqueville, the Frenchman, who wrote Democracy in America. But he didn't write that book until, I think, about 1840, and he was actually here in the United States on this tour in like 1831 and 1832, I believe. He was sent by the French government, he and another young man, to study the prison system in the United States. And that's how Alexis de Tocqueville happened to be going around the United States. He visited many cities and looked at the prisons that there were in those days in America. And he and his friend went back to France after 2 years, approximately, and gave a report on prisons in the United States. So, Alexis de Tocqueville, author of Democracy in America, a very famous book about what American society was like in the 1830s, and which is still read partly because people think that he kind of captured the American character, and that Americans are still, in some ways, kind of like de Tocqueville saw them in the 1830s. I remember one of the things that de Tocqueville said was that American women were outstanding and quite different from French women in that they were so independent And, you know, he was surprised to see young women traveling alone, you know, and without elders with them or a chaperone and that sort of thing. That was one of the things he noticed about America. And I'm sure that Harriet Martineau also was able to see that there were folks, women especially, doing things a little differently from the way they were done in England. Harriet Martineau returned to England and wrote even more books and articles, and she did have one problem, though, which may have been another reason why the young lady came up to her and sort of felt her over interestingly, and that was that because she was pretty deaf, she carried one of those old-fashioned horns around that people had in the 19th century, and deaf people, and so that people could speak directly into the horn, and the deaf or semi-deaf person could hear them better. I'm afraid I'm going to have to be getting myself one of those one of these days, since my hearing is getting a little bad too. But June 12th, 1802 was the birthday of Harriet Martineau, the famous English woman who is actually credited with being perhaps the first sociologist. She's considered to be one of the founding people of sociology, which is a very popular study these days, looking at society and writing about it and using it to help people who need help with social problems, and who compile statistics for us and that sort of thing. Harriet Martineau, a great founder of the whole field of sociology from the like I say, she lived from about 1802 to about the 1880s. So she was around for quite a while. Well, there are a number of other people obviously born in the month of June. And so I'm going to find some other ones here near this middle of June time. Here is a woman that probably the people out here have not heard about, and that is Artemisia of Halicarnassus. Artemisia of Halicarnassus. This is another example of a woman whose birthday was so long ago that they don't really know when it was. So our author here, Kirsten Olson, assigned Artemisia of Halicarnassus to June 17th. And if you happen to read this book, that's where you would find a little item on this woman. She was actually a queen in her day in the 5th century BC. She was born in the 6th century BC. The daughter, probably he had no sons, because she became queen of Halicarnassus after her father's death. And this woman, Artemisia, was a successful military leader. Successful military leader. You know, there are some people these days who say, well, goodness, how could Hillary Clinton be commander-in-chief? Women aren't that into, you know, military matters and so on. Well, Hillary ought to look up Artemisia as an example, I guess, of a woman who was a successful military leader. Now, how do we know that? One of the few things we know about her, actually, is that she was in the army of the, I believe, Persian Emperor Xerxes, who was deciding, he was busily moving west from Persia, which we call today Iran, and taking over a lot of the Middle East, the parts of the Middle East that are now, you know, very much in the news, like Syria and so forth. But Halicarnassus was in what they used to call Asia Minor, that is to say, the extreme western side of Asia before you get to Europe. And since Halicarnassus was there, Artemisia of Halicarnassus was asked by Xerxes to send ships and to come herself as commander of 5 ships which attacked the Greeks. And they attacked the Greeks in a famous battle in 480 BC called Salamis. I'm not sure that's the way you pronounce it. Maybe it's Salamis, but anyway, it's famous in history because it stopped Xerxes from invading Greece. And Artemisia was the captain of her 5 ships. She fought so hard that, according to Kirsten Olsen, Xerxes, who was looking at the battle, which he lost, made the comment, "My men are fighting like women and my women are fighting like men," because of Artemisia's strength in being the person who was trying at least to win Xerxes for his effort to send men and ships to conquer Greece, which failed at Salamis. So that is one Artemisia. Now, interestingly, there is a second Artemisia, also of Halicarnassus, and she was a wife of a later ruler, but she has given her name, Artemisia, to she was a researcher. There's another thing, you know, another stereotype. Oh, women don't do science and that sort of thing. But this Artemisia was an early botanist. And so her name was given many centuries later to a whole genus of plants, namely the plants that are arid plants, like sagebrush in the West is of the genus Artemisia, and there are other arid plants which are in that grouping, which 18th century scientists named the whole genus for Artemisia, the later queen of Halicarnassus, who was a famous botanist and in particular was interested in arid plants, which means that she must have been in an arid part, that Halicarnassus was in a relatively arid part of Asia Minor, maybe even Syria or somewhere in Turkey. I couldn't find out where Halicarnassus is, incidentally, by looking in the encyclopedia. They just kept mentioning the name, but they didn't really say where it was located, except it was in Asia Minor. And I think it was absolutely along the coast of Asia Minor, or we wouldn't have had the original Artemisia of Halicarnassus able to send 5 ships to Xerxes' battle at Salamis. So there is another woman assigned, as I say, to June 17th, because they don't know when she, what her birthday actually was, except that it was in the 6th century BC. In other words, she was born about, probably about 510 or 520 BC. Now, let's see, Matt, could we see the next picture? Okay, here we have a picture of a woman born on the 20th of June. Lillian Hellman, who was a famous writer of the, well, I wouldn't call it the early part of the 20th century, but she was certainly writing in the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s. And she lived until, she was born in 1907, and she lived until the 1980s. So she was quite a famous author, especially in the 1930s and 40s. Lillian Hellman, she was a Southerner, born in the South and raised in the South, but she made her way north fairly early on, as a late teenager probably, to New York, and later she was a screenwriter too. She's particularly well known for her first play called The Children's Hour. And The Children's Hour, which came out in 1934, written by Lillian Hellman, was a story about the power, the terrible power of rumor, and of the fact that the rumor that she wrote about, that was this sort of the central feature, was about two women who had a girls' school, and these two women were rumored to be lesbian. And this was a very serious rumor for people in the 1930s, when folks who were gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgendered, and queer were mostly in the closet because it was illegal in some places. Many states of the United States had laws against any kind of homosexuality. And so that was what formed the sort of the tension in her play, The Children's Hour, because one of the students of this school started this rumor about lesbianism, and it led to a, terrible end to the school itself, because so many families withdrew their daughters from the school after hearing that. And that was the line in the play, The Children's Hour. But she wrote a number of other things as well. I'm trying to think of the one that starred in the movie. It starred Bette Davis, and I do remember seeing it about 1940. That was also quite well known, and in fact Lillian Hellman worked on that screenplay, I believe, because she did go to Hollywood, became a screenwriter, like her lover, who was a famous author of detective stories. His name was Dashiell Hammett, and he was older than she, but he had already published a number of articles, and mostly, actually, rather than articles, they were short stories about criminals, shall we say, but they were often kind of humorous types of short stories. Some of them wound up as famous plays. Dashiell Hammett, for instance, was the author of the play about the black bird, that became such a famous play with, and as a movie, it was not a play. By then it had been a play, but it was a movie which starred Humphrey Bogart in the 1990s, the 1940s, okay? Well, is there any reason why Lillian Hellman is also still well known? There are several reasons, really, why she is still well known. One was that she was among the famous authors and screen personalities who were interviewed by the House Un-American Activities Committee. The House Un-American Activities Committee got going in the late 1930s. It was an investigative committee of the House of Representatives. And they were looking for anti-American philosophies and so on. I think they started out basically kind of looking for the Nazis because the Nazis were just getting going, obviously, in 1939. But they soon turned their attention to communists. And there were a number of people who became famous in the 1930s. Well, they didn't become famous because they were communists or communist sympathizers, but they became famous for, you know, what they actually did on the screen or writing or whatever. But after the Cold War started, after the Second World War, and that's a time I remember quite vividly because I was already a college student when the House Un-American Activities was investigating a lot of communists or supposed communists. One of the things that the House Un-American Activities was famous for was not only asking people about their own activities, you know, if they had, sent money to Republican Spain during the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 39 or something like that. But they also were asking people to name other communists or communist sympathizers that they knew. And if they wouldn't name them, the one thing that people could do to avoid naming any names was to take the Fifth Amendment. What that meant was the Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution provides that people who are accused of crime cannot be forced to testify against themselves, okay? So a number of these people who were accused of communism in a time when communists were exceedingly unpopular and it was never illegal. The Communist Party was not illegal. The Supreme Court did not ever say it was illegal. But it was sort of the kiss of death if you were accused of being a communist back in the late 1940s. And of course, in 1950, Joseph McCarthy, senator from Wisconsin, became really famous by saying in nearby Wheeling, West Virginia in 1950, before the Korean War broke out, that he knew that there were communists in the State Department and that in his pocket he had the names of something like 100 members of the U.S. State Department who were communists. Well, he never actually produced that list, but it became quite famous, and a lot of the people that he named were called before a Senate investigating committee that was headed by Senator Joseph McCarthy. This was not the House Un-American Activities Committee, which was what brought a California senator to fame, who later became President of the United States and actually resigned from the presidency in 1974 because of the Watergate scandal. But in the U.S. Senate in the 1950s, early 1950s, Senator Joseph McCarthy was head of a committee that was investigating communists, okay? And a number of people had come before the committee and had taken the Fifth Amendment and therefore they didn't have to testify. And then they were in hot water because people were so angry at communists, thanks to the fact that the dictator Joseph Stalin was in charge in the Soviet Union in those days. Russia was the biggest part of the Soviet Union, and after World War II, of course, Stalin, the dictator of the Soviet Union, had moved into Eastern Europe and taken over those countries in Eastern Europe as satellites of the Soviet Union. And but anyway, they were calling people before the Senate Investigating Committee, and they finally got around to Dashiell Hammett, and I don't think there was any question that he was either a member of the Communist Party or a very sympathetic person to communism. And I think he had taken the Fifth Amendment. But finally they called his lover, they never married, Lillian Hellman, to the Senate committee. And the interesting thing about Lillian Hellman is that she did not testify, and she did not invoke the Fifth Amendment, which were what had been happening, you know, all along before that investigating committee, as people tried to get out from either making themselves out as a communist agent or something like that, or by taking the Fifth Amendment, or naming names of other people that they knew, that they had associated with, that they thought were either communists or communist sympathizers. Well, Lillian Hellman was called before that committee, and she just said she didn't invoke the Fifth Amendment. She didn't name any names. She said, "I'll tell you anything you want to know about me, but I won't talk about anybody else." And they were so sort of surprised, they didn't even put her up for contempt of Congress. They just dismissed her after an hour's talking to her. But that was probably the first and most famous time that somebody before one of those investigative committees had just said, "No, I won't testify against anybody else. You can ask me questions about myself, but I won't name names, and I won't take the Fifth Amendment." So she got away with it. Well, quite some years later, I want to say something more about Lillian Hellman's fame. This was toward the end of her life in the 1970s. By then she was a woman in her 70s, obviously. But she was, I'm not sure whether she was screenwriter of the movie called Julia, but she had certainly written the original story. And this became a well-known movie called Julia, which had several women stars, quite well-known, one being Jane Fonda, and one being the English actress whose name's escaping me now, but who was a member of that famous family of actors. Her father had been in the movies in the 1950s, and then she was in the movies in the 1960s and 70s. And these two women were stars of the movie Julia. The story was, the basic story was that supposedly Lillian Hellman had gone across Nazi Germany before the war. This was actually during the time of the Spanish Civil War. Lillian Hellman visited Spain in 1937, and then she crossed Europe to go to a conference, which I think might have been in the Soviet Union in Moscow. But according to this story, she, on the way, had visited a woman that she had known many years before, a good friend from her girlhood. Well, not many years before, but say 15 years before or so. And this woman was living in Austria at the time. She was a doctor. And Lillian Hellman visited her. And this woman in Austria asked her to take some money to Berlin to give to a friend of hers. And according to the story, Lillian Hellman had put money inside a big hat that she was wearing. You know, women all wore hats in the 1930s when they went anywhere, and they often wore pretty big hats. And so she put it inside the, sort of the side lining, this money, took it to Berlin, and gave it to a woman in Berlin, and then went on to the Soviet Union. Well, this was made into a movie, and Julia was the name of the, sort of the fictional name, of the woman who had received this money. And the thing that happened was, and it was a very famous movie from 1976, I believe, but about a couple of years later, a woman surfaced who seemed to be the original Julia. She had been a doctor in Austria. She had had her leg amputated, like the woman in the that was in the screenplay, and so on. And in the story that Lillian Hellman told, this woman had died during the war, and Lillian had gone back to Europe and tried to find her daughter, this woman's daughter, in France. Well, a woman appeared in the late 1970s who sounded just like this woman. She was a New Yorker, and she had been a doctor in Austria, you know, various things that were almost exactly the same as the story that was told by Lillian Hellman. But this woman obviously hadn't died in the war, you know, and she didn't have a daughter that Lillian Hellman had tried to go and rescue, and all this kind of thing. And people started saying, what's the story with Lillian Hellman? I mean, you know, where did she get this story from, and why did she write a story in the 1970s saying that she had done this heroic thing about taking money to someone when she was crossing Austria and Germany? Well, you know. And so she was kind of under a cloud when she passed away in the 1980s from people who were saying they were not thinking back to the fact that she had been this heroine who had faced down the Senate Investigating Committee in 1952 by saying that she would not name names and not take the Fifth Amendment either. People sort of forgot about that, and they began saying, you know, she seems to be some sort of a liar, or she claims that she did this thing, but she obviously didn't because this woman survived. So, very strange. But Lillian Hellman her birthday is June 20th, and that's why I'm talking at some length about her today. And I want to also talk about someone who has a June 20th birthday, and that's myself, actually. I was born on June 20th, 1932, in the city of Manhattan, New York. My parents at the time were living just north of where today the United Nations building is, near the East River, and I was born in a hospital farther south in Manhattan. But I wasn't there very long. However, I do want to tell one story about that my mother told me from my babyhood, which was that especially after she visited a doctor, you know, taking the baby to the doctor and the doctors giving advice about things that should be done for babies. And she told my mother, the doctor told my mother that I needed sunlight. You know, in those days, they didn't have as much calcium pills with vitamin D in them, and vitamin D had just barely been discovered and heard of in those days. And about the only way to really get vitamin D was to be in the sun, get sunlight on your skin, and your body actually makes vitamin D from the sunlight in some wonderful chemical way that our bodies work. So I was in a basket out on the, just outside probably on the fire escape, sure, it must have been the fire escape. I was in a basket on the fire escape, getting my sunlight in this apartment. And it was a rather famous place because upstairs, right above my parents' apartment, was one of the heirs of the Chrysler fortune. And the Chrysler building had just been built, you know, in the 1920s in Manhattan, and it was very famous. It's got that Art Deco appeal with the top, the whole top with the layers and layers and layers, and then finally the antenna. Anyway, this fellow lived, who was a Chrysler, lived right above my parents as it happened. And when my mother brought me in from having my sunbath, she discovered that in the basket with me there was a large ash from cigar. And so she knew that unfortunately this Chrysler heir had just arrived at the window right above where I was, on the floor above me, and flicked his cigar out the window, and the ash wound up in my basket. But that's the kind of crazy story that sometimes your parents remember and will tell you when you're older. My mother told me that story about it. I was born in New York City actually about 2 weeks before the nominating convention, which I believe was held in Chicago, which named Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was then the governor of New York, to be the Democratic nominee for President of the United States. That was in July of 1932, and I was born June 20th. Well, that was the depths of the Depression, you know, and my father was lucky enough. He had had some problems with his previous employment, and he had gone west because some friends of his on the West Coast, where he had been born, had offered him a job as manager of a ranch in southern Nevada. And so he had gone out there to Pahrump in the about January of 1932, and my mother and I were still back in New York City. And actually, it was just after the new president, President Roosevelt, was inaugurated with his famous speech in which he said, you know, to the people who were suffering from the Depression and who were very depressed themselves because of the bad economy. He said, famously, Franklin D. Roosevelt said, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." And that was a way in which he kicked off the New Deal, in which they made work and put people to work doing things like civilian conservation corps, planting trees and building bridges that are still here, right here in Southeast Ohio and all over the United States. But it was just after his inauguration in March of 1933 that my mother and I took the train out to Nevada, to Las Vegas, because this ranch in Pahrump is located about halfway between Las Vegas and Death Valley to the west, which is mostly in California. And so I grew up in the state where there was plenty of Artemisia around, because if you'll recall, Artemisia, the second Artemisia, queen of Halicarnassus, was the botanist whose name was taken for the dry, arid desert plants, including sagebrush, which we had plenty of in the state of Nevada, and I saw plenty of growing up out there, because it is naturally a place with about 5 or 6 inches of rain, which means that sagebrush itself is lucky to survive with so little water available. Well, after living in Pahrump, we also lived in a place called Tonopah, like Pahrump. Supposedly that's the Paiute or Paiute word for water. So important to people who live in the desert. You really appreciate water when you grow up in the desert, believe me. We went to Tonopah, which was a mining town, silver mining town. Still, it had been one of those famous silver rush places back in the year 1900, but they were still mining silver in Tonopah when I was a girl in 2nd and 3rd grade in Tonopah. My mother was working at the time in the federal employment service in Tonopah, and that's sort of interesting. I'll tell you a little bit more about my mother, who became very interested in Nevada politics. And as I say, you know, she became a real New Dealer for the New Deal. She was working in politics in 1934 and 1935 while living at Pahrump. And in 1936, she went to the convention in Philadelphia, where Franklin D. Roosevelt was nominated for a 2nd term in office as president. And she had done so well in her election in November of 1936 that, and had spoken up so for Nevada at the convention the previous June, that she had become one of the women vice presidents of the Democratic Party. And in November of 36, when I was 4 years old, and I don't remember this bit about politics at all consciously, she was elected to the Nevada legislature, and she was the only woman who served in the Nevada Legislative House in 1937. And I have a picture that was sent to me by a woman who was doing research on women who had served in the Nevada legislature. And she sent me this picture that showed, 40 men or so in the Nevada House in 1937. And in the center of the first row is one woman wearing a white blouse, and that was my mother. Well, anyway, she later got this federal job with the Federal Employment Agency in Tonopah, and then later we moved to Fallon, Nevada, which is right on US 50. I was talking to a young woman who came across US 50 just a couple of weeks ago. And so she had gone right through Fallon, where my brother Bill still lives. So those are a few of the early days that I had. During World War II, I lived at the Naval Ammunition Depot in Hawthorne, where they were making ammunition for the Second World War effort. But that's enough about me. However, I just am reminding you again that June 20th is my birthday. I will be 84, and that's just coming up next week sometime. So give me a thought if you see this program during the coming days. And the fact that I'm going to be 84, and I'm beginning to show the efforts of it and the problems of it with my eyes and my ears and my walk, which is now why I have a cane to help with my balance, and so on. So June birthdays was the topic of today's program, and this is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday.